Take it away.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, here we go. My name is Carolina Montoya, and I'm coming to you all the way from Texas, here to defend my thesis titled America, Still the Land of Opportunity. Just a quick overview, we'll do a short introduction, and then we're going to look at previous literature that has been done on this topic. My research was divided into two studies. So then we will look at the results, discuss those results, and then future suggestions and any questions at the end. So the purpose of my study was to examine immigration attitudes and then look at the role that the respondents' gender, state of residency, ethnicity, and education played in their opinions on current immigration issues. We'll begin by talking a little bit about the importance of this topic. And so along with growing immigrant populations, attitudes tend to shift and may become skewed from time to time, but they're continually driven by various factors and some unique dynamics. And so the inflows have the potential to reshape political arena, and that's because governments must consider policies to not only manage immigration, but also to incorporate immigrants into society. And so the way immigration affects politics is dependent on, to an extent, on the attitudes and the views that are held by those native-born citizens and also majority groups in the area. My research, as well as other research, continues to, in order to better understand how these attitudes are formed, what the primary driving forces are, and then also some causal factors. In this research, the authors analyzed observational and quantitative studies that were done in the last 20 years, and they were trying to understand how immigration attitudes are formed. And so scholars have developed various theoretical models, but Heinmuller and Hopkins, they focused on these two that are listed here. The first was the political economic approach, and that one is a more formal model, and it focuses on the economic impacts of immigration on individuals. And that includes labor market competition or immigration's fiscal burden. So competition over resources between immigrants and natives. So that could be through jobs or like social services. The second approach was the socio-psychological approach. This is more focused on the cultural responses that are based on the perceived threats to the national identity or any prejudices that may be created or generated by the local group contact. And that includes assimilation, so how well immigrants become accustomed to the American culture, as well as language acquisition. So how well and how fast do these immigrants learn English when they get here? The next two slides will just show some relevant findings that were in Heinmuller and Hopkins research. Three of those important findings were that individuals at all skill levels and industries expressed more support for highly skilled immigration, as well as individuals who were higher skilled themselves were more supportive of all kinds of immigration. And then lastly, that opposition to immigration does rise with the misperception about the numbers, that inflow number of the immigrants entering the country. And this was seen through the political economic approach. And the authors concluded that there is little evidence that was found that immigration attitudes were primarily formed due to the personal economic situations. So although these do play a factor, they're not the primary determinants. As far as a socio-psychological approach, some of the findings were that perceived cultural threats were strongly correlated with more restrictive or like anti-immigrant attitudes. It was also seen that individuals with civic conceptions, so that's more of a person that a sense of a nation as a whole, but they base it more on like political institutions and liberal principles, and in which the citizens pledge to uphold the national identity, they tend to hold less restrictive attitudes, so a little bit more pro-immigration. And then lastly, the level of exposure to immigrants in proximity specifically to Hispanic individuals, it correlates with more restrictivism. And then here the authors concluded that the relationship between local demographic changes and immigration attitudes is conditional. It does depend on the national salience, so the importance or the focus of the immigration issues at hand. Some scholars have analyzed the role of geographic regions in immigration attitudes, and it's been shown that immigrant population size, the type of community, and the local politics all contribute to the resident attitudes. And so it was seen that individuals that live in a place that has a higher concentration of immigrants, one, they're more likely to identify immigration as a significant problem because they probably see it more often day to day. And then two, they hold more favorable attitudes. And this could be because they have more interaction with immigrants. And then Sarati and Shaw also found that cultural inertia, which is the desire to avoid cultural change, it predicts that the attitudes on immigrants vary and that they're influenced by the social context, but also the history of change of the area. And so it kind of touches on the metropolitan versus rural areas. And so views on immigrants are shaped by how much effort is needed to change oneself, to maybe change one's group, to accommodate the new group coming in, the immigrant group that may be different from their own. As far as demographic differences, we'll start with gender. O'Rourke and Senat found that gender was an important factor in the differences regarding immigration attitudes. They saw that women tend to be less pro-market in their attitudes than men, and so then they also saw that women are less anti-immigrant than men. Some of the other results were similar. Males are more likely to prefer a homogeneous society and a homogeneous source of income, homogeneous culture, and so they report higher negative feelings toward immigrants as compared to males. And this was DeHart and Davis in 2006. And then Carlson in 1971 found that females process experiences in relatively interpersonal, subjective, and ways in responding to issues. So this could possibly be an explanation for why women hold more favorable views on immigrants, and we'll talk about that in my results. As for education, literature uniformly agrees on a positive trend, positive relationship between education and pro-immigration attitudes. And so scholars believe that education is correlated with higher levels of diversity, racial tolerance, and maybe stronger inclinations for cultural diversity. This could be attributed to maybe having a wider knowledge, a more diverse social network, and maybe greater security. And then findings from Heinmuller and Hopkins were very similar in 2010. It found that U.S. natives who had more education saw both high and low skilled immigration. As well as in 2017, we saw that college education had a positive and significant effect on respondents' feelings toward immigrants. And then lastly, ethnicity. Group identity has a large impact on immigrant attitudes. Sarati and Shaw found that them and others have concluded that people often associate American identity with white American identity. And so as American cultural landscape can change because of those immigrant populations coming in, people may react negatively. Price in 2018 predicts a backlash from native-born whites due to the increase of the ethno-racial minority groups coming in and maybe, changing up some things. The majority group is expected to have more negative attitudes, as Walker presented, toward the immigrants, because they may perceive them as an intrusion on their culture, and they might feel that their rights are being infringed upon. So then racial and ethnic minorities tend to view immigration more favorably than the members of the majority group. For my study, I wanted to discover if there were any differences in Southern and Midwestern attitudes. So I compared Texas to Ohio. My questionnaire was the America's Still the Land of Opportunity, so ASLO, and it encompassed these 5 topics: sanctuary cities or detention centers, personal immigrant qualities, the sponsor visa programs, the DACA program, and then the U.S.-Mexico border wall. My 5 empirical questions were the following. So I wanted to know if one state had more favorable views toward immigrant populations. I was wondering if gender versus state of residency had a larger impact on these attitudes. I also wanted to know if one gender had more favorable attitudes toward immigrants, if one ethnic group had more favorable views toward immigrants, or if participants with a higher education level had more favorable views toward populations of immigrants. And then my hypotheses, I did believe that the participants in Texas would have more favorable attitudes. I suspected that the state of residency would have a larger impact on these immigration attitudes. I also believe that the female participants would have more favorable attitudes, that the non-white participants would have more favorable attitudes, and also that participants with a higher education would have more favorable attitudes. As for my methods, firstly, the participants, in total I had 90. 47 of those were from Ohio, 28 females and 19 males. And then 43 of these participants were from Texas, 20 of the 8 were females, 15 were males. All the participants were 18 or older, and they either lived in Ohio or Texas. All the participants were given consent forms and a demographic questionnaire, and then also the ASLO questionnaire, which we'll get to in a bit. The demographic questionnaire had 8 questions, pretty straightforward, just asked about their age, gender, ethnicity, only had 2 options, Ohio or Texas, for where they lived, their education level that they completed last, if they were a student, what their status was, employment, and marital status. As for the ASLO questionnaire, this was a 20 opinion-based statement questionnaire, and so those 5 that you see there are examples straight from the questionnaire. And they touched on the topics that we spoke of earlier, so detention facilities, immigrant qualities, visa programs, DACA, and then the border wall. And these were scored on a 6-point Likert scale. Participants could circle anywhere from 1 to 6, and that ranged from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And the score could vary from 20 to 120. As for my first study, it was a 2x2 factorial between persons, non-repeated. And I focused on the state of residency and gender for this one. As you can see, there is the chart with all of the cells that I compared, and then the dependent variable were the scores from the questionnaire. As for the second study, it was similar, but it was also a 2x2 factorial between persons, non-repeated, but the independent variables were ethnicity and education, and then dependent was still the scores. Again, you can see in the chart all of the cells that contain what I compared. For this, it was a little bit different because I had started with 6 different ethnic groups, but I actually had to consolidate participants into 2 different ethnic groups, as you can see there, non-white and white. And this was in order to properly analyze the data because I didn't have enough in each to make a comparison. And I also had to do that for the education level. So I had to consolidate them into 2 groups. For study 1, the results, this is just a descriptive of, you can see all the means. In all my results, all the lower scores, they represented less favorable attitudes, and higher scores represented more favorable. So just to look quickly, the Ohio males did have the least favorable, and the Texas females did have the most favorable attitudes toward immigrants. The next descriptive is similar, just differently organized by state and gender. And so we can see that Texas participants across genders and then female participants across states were the ones that had the most favorable views toward immigrants. Now we'll get into each variable. So here an ANOVA was conducted, and I wanted to see how the state of residency impacted their answers, and if it did. So you can see here that the Texas participants scored significantly higher than the Ohio participants on the questionnaire, and that was with the p-value of 0.05. And then in Ohio specifically, we see that the Ohio females scored significantly higher than the Ohio males on the questionnaire, and this was through a t-test with the p-value of 0.002. Sorry, very quickly. As far as Texas, there actually was no significant difference in the genders, but it was seen that the Texas females did score a little bit higher than the males. And then for gender, a t-test was done here to see if the attitudes differed based on gender. As you can see, the female participants scored significantly higher than the males with the p-value of 0.005. And then an ANOVA was done here to see if female immigrant attitudes differed based on their state where they lived. Texas females scored significantly higher than Ohio females, and that was at a p-value of 0.01. And as for the males across states, there was no significant difference in male participant scores, although Texas males did score a little bit higher than Ohio males. For this, t-test was done if the immigration attitudes differed in gender across states, and so we can see that Texas females scored significantly higher than Ohio males on the questionnaire with the p-value of 0.005. And then lastly, an ANOVA was done here, and you can see that Ohio females scored significantly higher than Texas males on the questionnaire with a p-value of 0.03. As far as my study 2 results, they looked a little different. So these are descriptives for the means by ethnicity. So you can see that participants in the non-white group scored higher than the participants in the white group. And here you can see that participants with an associate's degree or more scored higher than the participants with college or less. Some college or less. So a two-way ANOVA was conducted to compare the mean differences between the groups within the education and an ethnicity variable. And then secondly, it was performed to understand, to see if there was an interaction between the education and ethnicity variable on the scores. And so as you can see, there was no main effect from the ethnicity variable on the scores. And to the left, you can see that it was not statistically significant at 0.08. And then also there was no main effect from the education variable on the scores, not statistically significant with a 0.07. And although there were no main effects from the independent variables, there was an interaction effect present, which we'll look at next. Here you can see that the interaction between ethnicity and education had an effect approaching significance, so with the p-value of 0.056. And then a little bit deeper into the interaction, the main effect, was present from the education variable on the scores only within the non-white group, which was really interesting, with the p-value of 0.003, but it was not present for the scores within the white group. So I know that we just looked at a lot of results, so let me go ahead and just discuss what we saw. Just to refresh you, I wanted to examine how the participant gender, state of residency, ethnicity, and education affected immigrant attitudes, immigration attitudes. So as previous research has found, geographical proximity does play a role in shaping the public attitudes. As we can see, participants in Texas had more favorable attitudes, and this may be because
I'm sorry, Carolina.
Yes.
Can you put that interaction slide back up, please?
Yes. This one?
That one. Okay, I need to look at that a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, while he's looking at this, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Okay.
So where did you get the participants?
Where did I get the participants?
Yep.
So in Texas, when I was in Ohio, I got them from like a convenience sample.
I know that, yeah.
And
Texas.
then I actually traveled to Texas during my, I think it was like a break that we had. I came down and I did distribute a couple to like people I knew, and then also I had posted on like my social media if anyone wanted to help me with my study. So, and it ranged from Houston, Dallas, Austin, and some San Antonio, I believe, that some participants.
And what's the age range? Were they comparable, the two age ranges?
So what I found was that in Ohio it was more of a younger crowd, especially because I was there, and in Texas it definitely varied. It went anywhere from 20s to all the way to 50s. So that was the only reason why I couldn't really take age into consideration, because it was very vastly different, the two populations.
Did you do any comparison on age groups?
I did not know.
Okay. I'm wondering if one had a more liberal attitude than the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, so because when I looked at your scores, I was sitting here calculating your range, which was 0 to 120, with 120 being a more favorable attitude toward immigration. And the only ones that weren't scoring high were the Ohio males. They were in the medium category if you did a three-way split for range.
Yeah.
Okay, that's just why I wanted to know the age.
Okay. Should I keep going or?
Yes, keep going, thank you.
Let's see. Okay. Yes. So as we saw, the Texas had participants had more favorable attitudes, and this could be because they experienced more day-to-day encounters, like I mentioned before, just because of the higher concentration of immigrants in the South. And since Texas borders Mexico, individuals are more directly affected by this immigration. And so as for gender versus state of residency, gender had a larger impact on the attitudes because females within and across states had held significantly more favorable views. And then as far as males versus females, female participants had more favorable attitudes toward immigrants because, as we saw, overall females had the highest scores on the questionnaire. As for the second part, we did see that non-white participants held more favorable attitudes than white participants, but as ethnicity variable did not have a statistically significant impact. The same for the education. Participants with associates or above held more favorable attitudes than those with some college or less, but the education variable did not have a statistically significant impact. And then lastly, the interaction between the ethnicity and education revealed a nearly significant impact on participant attitudes. And so higher education significantly impacted only non-white participant attitudes positively, as we saw in the interaction figure. And a possible explanation for this could be that although white participants with higher education may be exposed to diverse populations when they go off to college or they continue studying, they may tend to hold more traditional views and oppose change as compared to maybe non-white groups. Some limitations and future suggestions. So I would love to obtain a larger and more evenly balanced participant pool. So I know that the males were kind of on the low number compared to the females, and that could have definitely skewed my data. And I would have loved to get a larger pool, and that would be to analyze the data with more statistical confidence, and then also provide maybe the participants with a reference fact sheet that includes statistics on immigration, and maybe giving the participants a knowledge questionnaire, not just opinion-based on the current issues, And that would be just in order to gauge if their attitudes are being formed from factual data or if it's more about outer influences like social media or word of mouth. And then lastly, I think it'd be pretty interesting to do a longitudinal study with the inclusion of other states across the US. And this could expand in order to observe any like immigration attitude trend changes. And that's definitely across time and different events that could be happening. And that is all I have for you.
I was thinking about Natalie's study while she was,
Yeah.
put those two.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that she presented last week.
Seems like 100 years ago. Did she do? Oh.
Well, she did an attitude turn immigration too.
I asked my question already, so.
So what's your big picture conclusion out of all that?
A big picture conclusion. So it was very interesting because the population that I surveyed here in Texas, like I told you, it was more of like a, I guess you could say, metropolitan. They lived in more bigger cities, and then versus in Ohio, it was more of a rural, small town. So I think from this results, it was definitely seen that geographic location does have an impact, just because of those interactions with immigrants, and sometimes it's difficult, obviously, to know if the person is an immigrant or not. But I feel like since Texas is a border state, you're more likely to interact with those immigrant populations, and so it would be really interesting to see like other states, like for example, like on the west and the east side, and compare, north, south, east, west kind of thing, to see if it's strictly location or if there's other factors that play in when addressing those attitudes.
I was surprised at how high they scored.
Right, me too. I was gonna say, let me see if I can pull it back up.
That they all, because remember I told you I broke up your range into 3, and they all were high except for Ohio males. They were medium. But
Right.
Given the political climate where there's this seemingly pervasive attitude against immigrants, this speaks directly against it.
Right.
That attitude is only a minority, let's hope.
Right, and this was done last year, 2019. So I would be very interested in doing this again now, currently, because I wonder if people will will change their attitudes and be willing to be more outspoken about it.
Well, do you remember your original design? Your original design was you're going to go into Mexico.
Yes, that was our original design. You're right. I had hoped to go down to Mexico and to some border towns, and just basically I would have had to translate the questionnaire into Spanish, and I would have given them the questionnaire just to see what the differences were. So that would have been amazing.
I remember that. That would be really interesting to see what they think.
Right. Yeah.
There you go. There's your dissertation.
For sure.
Yeah, that's very intriguing to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was interesting how the females were almost similar. They were very.
Yeah, there you go. Do you have any other questions?
Not really.
No, we're sitting here with our masks in various stages of on and off.
So you just need to fix your thesis for the formatting,
Uh-huh.
and we should be good. And it's the same thing I kind of told Sean, in your feedback, include a sentence about the results.
Okay.
Do you have any parting shots for the students here? You can't say, but the class about this.
Oh my goodness. That was not. Let's see. So I would definitely say take risks. I don't know if they told you, but I just went up and moved to Ohio to go to this program. It was a great decision. I loved it. I learned so much. Definitely my eyes were open to a lot of things happening, you know, just in society in general. And so, yeah, definitely encourage you guys to take risks, ask questions, you know, raise your hand in class. I know sometimes it's a little bit embarrassing, or maybe just you don't want to do it, but or even stay after and talk to the professors. It's very helpful to get their feedback. And just encouraging guys to keep going in whatever passion that is, whatever you know, topic that you guys are interested in, and just, you know, continue to fight.
I agree with you because I remember one time in our counseling class, after the class, you talked to me about this idea. So I agree with you. Talk to your professor and speak up in the class, right?
Yes, for sure.